Besides that, and along with all these white power, all these white, these filthy imperialist, capitalist white countries, that something is wrong with the Afghan under the leadership of the Taliban. Imperial powers have determined that the Afghans shouldn't have any rights at all, and that they press the people down and crush them. And so they use this kind of argument, the U.S. and the imperialist powers, white power, British, that Cornfield is talking about now. They use these arguments as a basis for being able to steal and loot Afghanistan even more. They won't even turn back over to the Afghan people their own money that have been locked up in these financial institutions, economic institutions controlled by the imperialists, in particular by the United States. And they engage in all kinds of wars against the Afghan people, trying to maintain confusion so that the Taliban will not be able to govern. And they use these arguments that the Taliban is undemocratic. Here, colonialism, they would declare, is democratic colonialism that will allow, in theory, women to be able to get an education and run for office in a colonial arrangement that's established for the purpose of sucking resources out of Afghanistan, that would be representing the Europeans, representing the U.S. as opposed to people in Afghanistan. So they say, we prefer this kind of democratic arrangement where this is democratic, what the Taliban doing, that kicks us out, that kicks the foreigners out, that kicks the aliens who are exploiting the whole country and the whole people out. That is undemocratic. Why they exclaim this is undemocratic, this is tyranny. Such an argument, I'm in Cornfield now. Such an argument overlooks the difference between fighting in the interest of the vast majority of the people to end exploitation and fighting in the interest of a small section to preserve or reintroduce exploitation. It overlooks the difference between defending the right of the vast majority to run their affairs in their own interest and defending the right of a small minority to keep the majority in bondage. In other words, it overlooks the difference between moving forward and backwards, between putting the clock ahead and putting it back, between revolution and counter-revolution. Of course, if we fight to achieve socialism, and if we achieve it, then we shall defend what we have achieved and shall not allow the slightest possibility of any group destroying that achievement. Let the capitalists and their hangers-on shout about democracy in general. If, as Lenin said, we have the brains to analyze the situation, we shall not be deceived by them. And by the way, when we talk about something like socialism, we are talking about this interim between what has been characterized as capitalism or what we characterize as the colonial capitalist mode of production. We are talking about this interim. Socialism is this interim between the defeat of colonial capitalism and the acquisition of communism, which is a classless society. And socialism itself is what is characterized as the dictatorship of the working class. When the working class, and there is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, as far as it's kept. Even the United States and its mediums that are screaming about the lack of democracy in Afghanistan once the U.S. and all of these thugs are kicked out. The fact is that they have a hidden dictatorship. The dictatorship is real, except as I need to. I'm not a hunter, but I'm told that in places like in the Arctic, where indigenous people sometimes might hunt a wolf, they'll Japanese blade, and they'll put blood on the blade, and they'll melt the ice and stick the handle in the ice so that only the blade is protruding. And that a wolf will smell the blood and want to eat, and it'll come and lick the blade, trying to eat. And what happens is when the wolf licks the blade, of course, he cuts his tongue and he bleeds, and he thinks he's really having a good, and he drinks and he licks it. Kills himself. That's what the imperialists did to us with crack cocaine. You got these young brothers out there thinking that they're getting something that they're gonna make a living with. They're getting something they can buy a car like the white people have cars. White people don't have a car. They get something where they can get a piece of gold. The white people have gold. White people have gold. They getting something to get a house. The white people have a house. White people have a house. And they actually think that there's something that's bringing resources to them, but they're killing themselves just like the wolf who's making the blade, and they're slowly dying without knowing. That's what's happening to the community. You heard me right? That's exactly and precisely what happens to the community. And instead of blaming the hunter who put the damn handle and the blade in the ice or the wolf, then what happens is the wolf gets blamed for time. That's what happens in our community. You don't blame the person, you don't blame the imperialism. White power is the enemy. Was the enemy when they first came to Africa, snatched up the first African, brought us here against our will, is the enemy today. That's the thing that we have to understand.
Hold on, it's No Cops on Live. It's Black No Cops on Live. The official, or one of the official political education and recruitment platforms for the Black Community Control of Police movement of the Black is Back Coalition. This is Theophilus Obala. I'm a proud member of the Black Community Control of Police Working Group, and I coordinate this particular session known as Black No Cops on Live. And essentially what it is bringing our political stance towards the police and the military occupation and our opposition to the military occupation of the community. You know what I'm saying? We bring that stance into an actual political and geographic space where we bring the discussion, not only bring it to the streets, so to speak, but also this is a front upon which anti-colonial political struggle can be waged. For example, the police pulled up on an African across the street from where I'm standing right now, where I stand every Thursday. And in the process of them pulling them over, we was able to mobilize and intervene in that stop, and at minimum make the African aware of the fact that the police do not have the right to stop you for something that is lower, what they call lower level traffic offense. So that's something that all Africans should be educated around. It's a question of knowing one's rights and therefore having a certain kind of legal and political basis for resistance against that stop. So we could not do that if we just did Black No Cops on Live, you know, indoors as such. And that's not to say that indoor political education is not necessary and effective, but we want to actually build a social movement, a revolutionary resistance against the military occupation of the African community. So the people is here, and we want to bring this discussion here, and at the same time function as an outpost, as a station for Black community control of the police. So I just want to say those things. And the topic of today's discussion, I'm going to hold it up for the camera real quick, is Africa Must Lead. It might show up backwards on Facebook and on YouTube. I don't know. It seems to be on the right side on YouTube. But the topic that we're going to be dealing with today is that of Africa Must Lead. And we're talking about Africa Must Lead in the context of a lot of economic and political activity, both struggle against U.S. and European colonialist capitalism in terms of its leadership over the colonial capitalist worldwide economy, struggle that's being waged in a number of different ways on the part, of course, like China, Russia, India, etc. And but we want to also expose the fact that this activity, or what some may even call struggle, still occurs within, as Chairman Amali Yeshitela has been teaching us over and over again, it occurs within the colonial mode of production, meaning that its struggle, its economic activity that relies on the expropriation of Africa's resources and the exploitation of African workers in general. In order for there to be any class struggle or economic development in, of course, the white world, within the white oppressor nation, but even within emerging or aspiring capitalist forces like China, India, Russia, and others. So we want to, expose the fact that all activity does not necessarily constitute revolutionary activity, but that is not to say, and I just want to put these disclaimers out there and also just be clear that this is all going to end up as a discussion of why we must build Black community control of the police, not only as a means of defending and liberating the African working class, but of the oppressed workers of all oppressed nations. So the question of African revolutionary struggle is central to the question of socialism anywhere. And we're going to connect that. And the reason why I raised that is because even as we have certain types of criticism of what China is doing in Africa and other parts of the world, including its own territory, this is by no means a statement or an expression of any form of unity with the US or Europe, who are in direct contention or competition with China. So it's important to say that just because we have criticism of, and when we say, the other thing I want to say is that when we say China, we're referring to the state power of its ruling class. And we're going to offer up certain historic evidence to point to the fact that the Chinese state and its economy, the economy that it defends, is a petty bourgeois force that actually represents a deviance from the line of march established by Mao Zedong. And that's important because Mao saw this coming, before he died. And he called on the masses, the workers, and the youth, and the students, and other democratic forces, but particularly the workers, to barrage the headquarters and to wage incessant struggle with the opportunism being displayed by the Chinese Communist Party at that time. Now, whether or not this act or this move was consistent with democratic centralism may be up for debate by some, but the reality is that the outcome of the divergence that occurred between Mao and his, if you want to call it successful, whose name I think is Yao Ming. I don't want to misquote, but the one that came after Mao. So anyway, but we have that here. But I just want to say that we do recognize the class character of the activity that China is engaged in, but we do not make it confuse. We don't confuse the Chinese petty bourgeois or aspiring capitalist state of China with the proletariat of China. So when we say the Chinese, we're not talking about the masses. We're talking about the social force that controls the state and conducts economic activity in Africa and other parts of the world under the name of China, but we're talking about a particular social force within the Chinese nation or population. So that's important to say. But again, even as we have criticisms of these forces, that is not a statement of unity with US imperialism, European imperialism, with whom China's in contention. But another thing that we want to say before I'm actually, because we wrote up essentially a position on these dynamics and the question why the building of the African revolution under the leadership of a worldwide revolutionary party of the African working class is critical in moving all of this forward in the right direction, based on all of the observations and factors that I've said thus far. Most important of which being the fact that Chinese and Indian and Japanese and Russian economic development at this particular moment occurs on the pedestal of the colonization and the exploitation of Africa right now. And that, in fact, the Chinese and these other forces, their activity in Africa is actually, objectively speaking, is protected by the presence of the US imperialist state and its neo-colonial forces. That's to say that China can be sure that its investments, resources, etc. in Africa will not be fucked with by quote unquote pirates or terrorists or any other label that they want to give these sectors of the African working class. The only thing that really ensures that China is safe from these so-called threats is the presence of US imperialism itself. That is the primary factor in maintaining imperialist peace on the continent of Africa, or as the chairman says, peace on the plantation. So it's not just the white man that benefits from that peace, but it's all participants in the colonial capitalist or benefactors of the colonial capitalist system. So we're going to talk about that, put forth some numbers that you may not have been aware of. And and hopefully the other thing I want to say, y'all, you know, as a movement, we are a working class movement. As Black is Back and the Uhuru movement, etc., we are a working class movement. So we do not have the resources that any given, you know, major news network that you watch on TV or internet or YouTube. They got the fancy situation going on. They have resources, but more than just the appearance. The reporter, the one that's sitting in my shoes right now on ruling class media, it's not like they wrote the shit that they saying to you. They have a team of researchers and shit whose job 24/7, they get good money for this. All they have to do is pull up facts and find out this and that, and they even have correspondents on the ground in these various places on the planet. They have forces, reporters right now. NBC has forces stationed in every part of Africa right now, you know, and other parts of the world as well. So the point is that they have vast resources that give them the ability to talk about in a really vivid and graphic way what's going on any way they want to talk about, even though they don't talk about 99% of the things that they know about and actually have material and footage and information about, but they decide that all they're going to talk about is Omicron or whatever is of the most strategic interest of the bourgeoisie at any given moment. That's what they show you. They're not going to, NBC News will never run a story on Ethiopia, the neo-colonial civil wars, quote unquote, that's going on in Ethiopia, or the military aggression of the masses protesting the recent coup organized by a sector of the Sudanese military. NBC not talking about that, and there's a reason why. They don't want you to even consider these issues. They want you to think about and think in a way that that will facilitate their ability to take your money, right? And that's what that whole Omicron and the COVID shit at this point is clear that Omicron, if you get it, most is going to happen if 99.999 10 times out of 10 is a cold, right? Cold-like symptoms, right? And but they're making everybody get a vaccine for this, you know. And you know, like we said before, this is based in their need for profit, because there's a lot of money obviously being generated through this whole vaccination process. So but that's an entirely different discussion that we're gonna have at a later time. But we want to get into this whole question of the necessity for Africa to lead in all political and revolutionary struggle occurring on the planet Earth today. So but yeah, the reason why I talked about the news forces, like the bourgeois media news, is because we have a limited capacity, you know, in terms of what we are able to research at any given time, because all of our forces got jobs and kids and things that, you know, interfere with their ability to do just this. So we have a certain type of we have to overcome these particular types of obstacles to get the knowledge that we really need to have around any given question, and more than that, generating the ability to talk about it and to get that discussion available to masses of people. So this is really a call to those of you who are watching to become a researcher for Black No Cop Zone, right? For Black community control of the police, so that we now have forces that submitting us, you know, basic stories that we don't have to, I don't have to research every single issue in the same kind of way, because now we have a team of forces that can simply write up what I should say about Sudan, you know, write up what I should say about Ethiopia, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a call for people to participate in that process. But the most important thing is to say, because right now, just because we don't necessarily have the capacity to talk about everything that needs to be talked about, because there's 5 billion Africans on the planet Earth right now. You know, 1.5 billion Africans on the planet Earth. And we live in at least 54 countries in Africa, and then another 50 states in North America. And within each of those territories are all types of struggles that it's impossible for one human being to keep track of, right? And I'm not even talking about South America or Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. This is just two, you know, one continent, one, you know, in one country. But the point I think you get, you know, but this is the thing, y'all. You don't have to know everything because, in fact, we strategically do sessions on the overarching issue that the question of what's going on in Sudan would fall under, which is coups, right? Understanding the difference between a coup and a revolution. Because if you understand the difference between a coup and a revolution, we did a session on this. You understand that a coup is not controlled, led, or organized by the people. And therefore, whoever emerges as the new power, so to speak, from the coup is going to be the one that writes all the rules. And they have the state, they have the military capacity to enforce those rules. But the people have been locked out of the ability to A, to be armed, and B, to be armed to defend policy that they develop and that speaks to the interests of the people. Which is why, even though you got literally in Africa, there's at least 2 coups going on the continent of Africa on any given day. And they not all in the same place. There's coups going on in Africa all the time. But what you got to understand, sometimes the one that wins the coup emerges and talks like they militant and they radical and how they're going to make sure they look out for the people, etc. Right? So, but that never happens. And the question of why does that never happen? And we believe, we know that the reason why that never happens is because we have not thoroughly consolidated a revolutionary organization on the ground wherever these coups occur that enables the people to say, this is the program that you as the new government must abide by. We say we need electricity, we need health care, hospitals, we need schools for the children. We need demand, and please don't interrupt while I'm doing this. We're going to wrap after I finish, all right? But you know what we're doing, comrade. So that's the thing. So we want to make sure that we have, you know, we may want to make sure that, and I gave you this one too, right? Yeah. Yeah, and that's real shit. So the people have to be armed with the program. And that's why we do this session, so we can arm the people with a program. Yeah. So that's one thing we want to say. So now, we wrote a piece, right, dealing with, but the thing is, if you understand the fundamentals, of any of these questions, then you understand the critical question. Because you don't need to know exactly what's going on in Sudan in order to know where the people, I'm talking about the people. We don't need to know everything about the military forces that took control to know whether or not we should unite with them, because they came in power as a consequence of the organizational struggle to build a government controlled by the workers. You know what I'm saying? And so that's one example. So we do, and when the coup happened in Guinea-Conakry, we did a piece on coup versus revolution. We didn't just say we're going to just talk about Guinea-Conakry, because the reality is where the new Prime Minister Diallo stands on any given question remains to be seen, because he doesn't have an organization that has a concrete platform and whatnot. And we're saying that that's the contradiction. But the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, the party, the Black is Back, we have a revolutionary national democratic program that we can use as the measuring stick to determine who is serving our interests and who is not. And not only in terms of what they say, but how they move on a day-to-day basis. And more than that, this program demands and requires that the government facilitate the organizing of the people, and that the organization of the people abides by certain organizational principles that guarantees, that ensures that the dictatorship of the African working class. So that's why the work we're doing is so critical. And whether you blow trees or what, I don't care about that. You know what I mean? Don't do that which is going to harm your body. You know what I'm saying? And don't do that which is going to undermine your ability to think straight. And, you know, we talk about concretely what that all means, but these are some important points. And, you know, on the police question, the average African couldn't tell you exactly how many Africans were stopped or stop and frisk by the police in 2015. We can tell you that it was 250,000, 750,000, right? We can, but the people couldn't. But the people don't need to know the exact number just to know that the police fuck with black people disproportionate to the way they fuck with white people. You don't need to be well versed in all the, and I don't want to say minute details, but the dates and the chronological details of every particular phenomenon in society to understand enough about that society and the forces relationship to that society and the social system to know what their relationship is to you. That's the reality. So these are things that we want to and must say about how we got to build the capacity to talk about more stuff, but also how we have to apply a certain type of scientific strategy to understanding how to understand the world. Again, you don't have to know all the details to know the police have a particular kind of relationship to black people, you know? And so every session in the Black No Cop Zone, we struggle to arm the people with that understanding how to understand shit and understanding how to move around shit, regardless of all the, because I guarantee you that what's going on in Philly is going on in your town right now. It's going on in terms of how the state moving, in terms of how the local city council moving, in terms of how all these, the petty bourgeoisie, they all move in the same way no matter where they at in the planet. But we don't have to talk about your specific situation to talk about your specific situation, because we're talking about what's going on in Philly, and rest assured, the state and all these other forces move the same way where you are, and not only in this country but around the world. So this is an important overview I wanted to offer up. And like I said, this is an outpost. So if the police step, if they run up, there's going to be a response. And we struggle with the people to participate in that resistance. And we struggle for economic development. You know what I'm saying? I saw a comrade hold up Dipset, right? Dipset, which was, you know, it's a rap group. Yeah. Let me just finish this, man. And then I'll Dipset. I can't do nothing for you right now. Hey, yo, bro. Yo, bro.
Yo, leave him alone. Leave the man alone.
Please, I'm trying to get through this shit.
Please, leave him alone. Go on about your business.
Thank you, bro. Man, listen, man.
Yeah.
This is how we have to do it. And being out here comes with contradictions. It does. But that's why we got the people, man. My man Coups took care of that, man, because the people know. Some people don't. But the people that need to know, and they're able to. That's how it works, baby. I like that. I like that. All right, so let's move forward. And you know, we talk after this shit. Oh, we talk. But right now we got to get through this, man. If y'all think I should do this inside, let me know. I mean, you think it's not a good idea? I think it's a good idea to be out here because, again, we on post, we on point outreach. Police run up, you know, it's gonna be a response, like a political response, and we need that shit. And that's why we want y'all to build. We're gonna put this shit on tour. We're gonna take Black No Cop Zone on tour. We need to bring this shit to your city, the paint and all that. You see what I'm saying? This is what we need, y'all. I'm telling you. All right. So, all right, this is what we wrote for immediate release. Oh, and also, last thing, I want to really, again, you know, this recognize my leadership as far as Chairman Omali Ishitella, the founder and leader of the Uhuru movement, you know, the leader of the worldwide African revolution, and you know, the strategic thinker behind all of this. And our job as cadre, really, this is real shit. Our job as cadre of the party, whatever party you in. Your job as cadre, as Le Duan said it best, of the Vietnamese Workers' Party. Le Duan, he was like, yo, among the qualities of a good cadre is his or her ability to implement the determinations from the higher body, right? So your higher organization, whether it be the Congress or the district or the region or whatever, but the higher organization brings to you as a lower the overall strategic objectives that you should be engaged in. But a good cadre finds a way, you know what I mean? Because the higher body is not on the ground where you at. They don't know Comrade Coups, you know what I'm saying, that took care of that. They don't know him. But the cadre that has unity with the mission that's been given to them by the higher body finds a way and uses the highest degree of ingenuity, creativity, and sheer muscle to get it done. That is the stance of the cadre. So what I mean to say in all this is that the chairman is the strategic thinker. He is the leader of that higher body, of the highest body of our movement. But we as the leadership of the various mass organizations and other constituents of the point of the spear, we have a responsibility to carry out the strategic objectives that's laid out in the Congress report, really. You know, it lays all of it out, from the economic work to the democratic struggles and shit, you know, all of that, and even how we understand some of the issues that we're going to get into today. But a good cadre, it implements the shit creatively and in a way that speaks to the what you understand to be the spirit of the mission, the goal, the fundamental goal, you know. So anyway, we're gonna go ahead and just move on. But we quote the chairman in his most recent report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party, and it's called Vanguard, right? So we're gonna quote some stuff out of there, and I'm gonna tell you where in a minute. Yeah. So the U.S. This is for immediate release. The U.S. and China, the two largest economies in the world, get 70% of their natural resources from Africa. Africa produces 75% of the world's coltan, 35% of uranium, 66% of the world's manganese, 50% of gold, 90% of cobalt, and 90% of platinum. While white North American, European, and even Chinese workers experience a certain form of exploitation at the hands of their capitalist ruling classes, there would be no jobs to be exploited in China, London, or the US without the extraction of Africa's resources. Raw materials taken from African soil and converted into commodities in the factories of industrialized capitalist centers. And we say in the fact, you know, raw materials converted in the factories of these capitalist centers. And, you know, we mean that literally and figuratively, because not all of that process occurs within the imperialist centers. You know, in fact, the imperialists, and part of its counterinsurgency against the Black Power Revolution of the 60s involved transporting these factories to Mexico and other countries outside of its own territory as a means of getting cheaper labor, and also as a part of the economic blockade on the African working class and the Black community in general. But so it's not simply about, you know, Chinese workers working in the factories, but we're talking about the influx of resources that some of the transformation of which sometimes occurs outside of China, Europe, North America, but still facilitates a whole system of economic activity within the imperialist centers itself. For example, if, you know, people out here that do Uber, right, or DoorDash or Uber Eats, like food delivery, or Uber itself transporting, you know that there'd be enough white people that you taking to and from work and shit like that, and you know that they don't be working in no factories, they work in, you know, office centers, and they go to airports, and all this is economic activity, but none of it will be possible without the extraction of Africa's resources. You know, these offices, these corporate headquarters, you know what I'm saying? You got Comcast, I think, got his headquarters here downtown, and you know, there's no you know, production as such occurring in terms of, like, you know, making phones and, you know, factory work going on in the Comcast center, but there's a lot of people that work there, and there's an entire economic, you know, prosperity that is built off the fundamental expropriation of the minerals necessary to produce the shit that Comcast not only sells you, but also the services that they sell you. All the technology relies on African minerals like coltan and shit. So anyway, while white North America, yeah, so more importantly, the 500-year-long military occupation of Africa by the US and Europe is what maintains the stability necessary to ensure that all of white power, and even China, has the ability to extract our resources. And this is not to say that China does not have its own interests, you know, because it does. And if given the opportunity, will completely replace the US in terms of the primary economic and military power on the planet Earth. But or at least undermine or neutralize the U.S.'s ability to occupy space that it would prefer to occupy. We'll put it like that. But so while more importantly, the 500-year-long military occupation of Africa by the U.S. and Europe is what maintains the stability necessary to ensure that all of white power and even China has the ability to extract our resources. And we talked about that. Yeah. There can be no real socialist revolution anywhere on the planet without the leadership of the revolutionary socialist struggle to liberate Africa. And I want to just real quick read a piece from the chairman's book, page 165, right? That's putting forth a pretty, it says, you know, this piece is entitled Capitalism Was Born and Will Die in Africa. And he says, today, the US, all of Europe, Israel, Canada, and other European settler states, along with China, Japan, India, Turkey, and any other ambitious would-be capitalist power, are concentrated in Africa like leeches enjoying a feeding frenzy. This concentration of strategic global capitalist interests in Africa is immeasurably important for the defeat of capitalism as a world system. A single grenade will destroy the entire system. Africa was the critical factor in the advent of capitalism. Comrades, sisters, brothers, Africa, the African Socialist International allows Africans to play our historically predetermined role to destroy imperialism. Capitalism born through imperialist intervention in Africa will die in Africa. Yeah. And there's more he says, but we're going to get into that. So let's continue on. Let's see. So, and as Chairman Amali Ishitella has stated, the true class contradiction is not at the point of production in a Chinese or European factory. It is at the point of the rifle. That's important. That's the most important thing that we're trying to get at, because some would try to characterize, again, some would say that what China is doing is part of some type of revolutionary project. But although that may be how some people feel, but in the real world, China, its entire, the basis of its wealth relies on the imperialist occupation of Africa and its own expropriation of Africa's resources. And the real contradiction is if there is exploitation of Chinese workers by the Chinese capitalists, it is exploitation that is only possible through the expropriation of Africa's resources. If there's a factory in China that makes iPhones, it is only because the coltan needed for that iPhone come from a mine in Congo where the workers are paid 5 cents a day. So this is the basis of the economic development that occurs within China. And if you want to talk about revolution, just think about it. What kind of revolution? Let's say that the Chinese workers organize or struggle for revolution within China to achieve power over the current capitalist or petty bourgeois Chinese state, right? But even if such a struggle was successful, how would the new ruling class in China relate to Africa? What would change in terms of the expropriation of Africa's resources into China's economy? The only difference then would be possibly that instead of the current petty bourgeois force that controls the Chinese capitalist state, it is now a new state controlled by new forces. But the relationship to Africa, that's the question. That's the question that we really have to respond. That's what the question that China has to answer to. And the African working class has to be organized to dictate what that relationship looks like. But part of what we are saying in this presentation is that the Chinese proletariat has the opportunity to unite under the leadership of the African Revolution to struggle with its own capitalist ruling class to end the parasitic relationship that it has with China. And the Chinese workers say, if there is a economic boom occurring in China, it's not going to be at the expense of African babies on the continent. The Chinese proletariat has to stand up and make that stance against the current capitalist ruling class in China. That's what the Chinese working class has a responsibility to do. And even the other democratic forces that may be able to unite with such a stance should do the same. And so we are saying that such a relationship and process can be organized if we understand this entire situation correctly and how forces can be won. Yeah, so you know, the true, and like you say, you know what I mean? It occurs at the point of the rifle. Man, I gotta finish this, all right? You know what I mean? And we're gonna wrap afterwards, okay? And we all without the mask, and you know, come on. So let me finish me, and then I'll let you. Yo, cool. Cool. Whatever, man. All right. There's nothing to say. Let's see here. All right, man. So there can be no, yeah. So yeah, the true class contradiction, as the chairman said, is not at the point of production in a Chinese or European factory. It's at the point of the rifle, and all rifles are aimed at Africa. The struggle for black community control of the police, the struggle for the rifle, is central not only for control of the rifle. It's not only the question of African liberation, but socialism anywhere on the planet. Through this presentation, we issue a directive to the workers of oppressed nations, including China, India, Russia, to organize under the leadership of the African Revolution, to organize under the leadership of the African Socialist International, Chinese presence in Africa. So according to a news apparatus called Gravitas, it's on YouTube, they did a special that talks about some of the relationships that are occurring between China, India, and other forces in Africa and the US. So they said, look, quote, 1 in 5 infrastructure projects in Africa was funded by China. It is building every third one. Africa has a deficit problem, and China has a signed checkbook. Starting 2005, China invested $2 trillion in Africa. It has built 6,200 kilometers of railways, including the continent's longest railway line connecting Ethiopia to Djibouti. We got to talk about the comrade, the truck driver in Colorado, I believe, who they tried to give 100 years to because his truck collided, you know, caused a serious, like, chain, you know, what do they call it? When they pile up and kill people and stuff, and they trying to charge this worker with murder, and they did, and they convicted him and gave him 100 years. But the workers, the truck drivers mobilized, shut down the roads, all entries into, basically no trucks is going into Colorado. And subsequent to that, we saw a report that they reduced the sentence to 10 years, but we are opposed to that charge, the arrest, the charge, the conviction. And this is a way that the bourgeoisie tries to shift the burden of its own opportunism, the contradictions created by its own opportunism, forcing truck drivers to sit down in very bad for your posture kind of positions for 20 hours a day to meet deadlines that they set that impose inhumane conditions on the workers. And of course, in this case, the brother's brakes did not work. It was not his fault. The truck malfunctioned. And so anyway, we unite with that struggle going on out there, and we're going to talk more about like organized labor and struggle in the state. And that's a really good struggle. All right, so Africa has a deficit problem and China has a signed checkbook. A deficit problem, we should note, that is caused by imperialist domination, 500 years of imperialist occupation. Starting 2005, China invested $2 trillion in Africa, built 6,200 miles of railways. We said that. Beijing also has built the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, right? Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, who's getting military aid from imperialists neo-colonial imperialist forces like the UAE to fight the Tigray Liberation People's, TPLF, Tigray People's Liberation Front. You know, what does China get out of it? A lot. Geopolitical influence to start with. Beijing is selling its influence, its culture, its currency, and Guinea-Bissau exit signs are written in Mandarin. China has established 50 Confucius institutes across 33 countries. Several African countries use Chinese currency. China also gets a strategic overseas base. There's more that they say, but the point is China has deep interest, a lot of capital invested in Africa, in economic activity in Africa that only it will benefit from. That's what the point is, right? And so that's and then so whether internet intentionally or not, the Chinese, India, Japanese capitalist states gain access to African resources through reliance on US-led colonialist capitalist status quo. And although these forces seek economic development independent of US and European-led colonialist capitalism, they do so while being incapable of ensuring capitalist extraction of Africa's resources without US military presence and neo-colonial states often supported by US and European imperialism. You know, and this is really important because the Chinese, they benefit from the presence of the colonial state, the US colonial state. You know, and that's again the chairman talking about colonialism as a mode of production. For example, in Ethiopia, China has $4 billion of direct investments, $13.7 billion in loans and conducts, $5.4 billion in bilateral trade. You know, more said, the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, a known ally of US and Israeli imperialism. And we have to talk about Syria, right? And we say hands off the Syrian people, hands off Syria, Israel must go, victory to Palestine. We're gonna talk about that more. So, you know, it just lays out those, you know, so the United Arab, you know, we said already how the UAE, a known ally of US and Israeli imperialism, provided arms for the Ethiopian military with whom China's dealing with, you know. In fact, China's only overseas military base is in Djibouti, where 500 Chinese troops at the most are stationed. And stated reason is the quote-unquote, the completion and commissioning of the base will help China better fulfill the international obligations of the United Nations and help China make new contributions to Africa and the world's peace and stability. This is contrasted with the US itself, which has 29 known military facilities in 15 countries on the continent of Africa, while France has bases in 10 countries. The largest US base is in Djibouti, where 5,000 US troops are stationed. And this is important as well to talk about in terms of this whole question of, you know, because what is the purpose of the state? As we say all the time, the state is an organization of violence and coercion that emerges in society to maintain the status quo and to protect the economic interests of the ruling class of that society, whatever social force controls the state. So in the system of slavery, the slave owner controls the state, controls the police, the prisons, etc. And the state will be mobilized to put down any force that tries to disrupt the status quo in the system of slavery. Like Nat Turner was literally caught by the police and put on trial. And so China's really not that much different. And the UN peacekeeping mission that China refers to is essentially a mission to maintain the colonial capitalist status quo. To make sure, like Djibouti is right near the Horn of Africa, right? Where there's been all types of economic resistance occurring at the hands of African working class off Somalia's coast. They call them pirates. And there was like the brother Abdul Wali, right? I remember that. But anyway, you know, the pirates, these African workers who had the audacity to take up guns and to rob the corporate ships, liners, the tank liners that are literally transporting our stolen resources to places like China and Europe. So, you know, from the perspective of the African working class, the pirates are the good guys. But from the perspective of the Chinese, in the UN and the US, the pirates are a problem. And so, you know, the Chinese say out their mouth in this quote that they have military presence to support the UN and the peacekeeping mission. So, you know, this is important, y'all. All right, we're going to continue on. And I want to just read real quick a quote out of the chairman's book, the report to the Congress on page 169. It deals with the question of the U.S. presence in Africa. It says U.S. expands, this is the subhead, U.S. expands military presence in Africa. The French have military forces that are active in at least 14 different French neo-colonies. But the most noteworthy imperialist military presence in Africa is that of the U.S., which has created a special command force that is solely dedicated to the entire continent. The Africa Command, or AFRICOM, has the responsibility for crushing any independent political or military activity that might threaten U.S. domination of Africa. AFRICOM is also in Africa as the muscular threat to China and other challenges to U.S. hegemony on the African continent that is the birthright of Africans the world over. But we're seeing in the most recent period that the Chinese benefit from AFRICOM's presence in terms of it's serving as a deterrent to the so-called pirates and other forces that would pull a jack move on the Chinese as quick as they would on any other white power capitalist ship. So this is important shit, man. And it goes on to quote specific activities on the part of U.S. Army Special Operations. Let's see, it's a lot to read, and I know we short on time. But this is really important because the chairman really, lays out from A to Z in terms of the responsibility of the African working class to build its own revolutionary party and to fight to consolidate defense and liberation from these colonial forces that wish to continue to suck us dry. So the chairman speaks on this, and we're gonna cite more of that in further sessions. And the one thing that we want to contribute to this discussion tonight, again, is the question of the role that the Chinese proletariat itself can and must play in overturning the colonial capitalist mode of production, and thus uniting with the African Revolution. Yeah. All right. So we got and that means something concretely here where we are in the U.S. and other places. If we can just get in the same if we can just get in the same page and POA or whatever. Whether it's let's see here. It is this U.S. and European military presence in Africa that provides the stability China and other capitalist forces need to expropriate Africa's resources. China does not mention the desire to contend with U.S. colonial occupation of Africa by the U.S., but rather to contribute to the same status quo or peacekeeping-seeking mission that the United Nations was created by the U.S. to maintain throughout the world. Speaking as a communist and an African internationalist, Chairman Omali Yeshitela sums up the primary contradiction within all economic and political struggle occurring within the planet and even against U.S. colonial capitalism. These forces can include China, India, Japan, and Russia, all of whose power is based on the revolutionary periods of struggle referred to in this quote. Quote, to reckon, and this is from Omali taught me Sunday study a couple weeks ago. To recognize the relationship is to recognize that the well-being of white people or anybody who might fit into the category of a colonizer or any society that fits into the category of being a colonizer society lives at the expense of those that are colonized, rather than recognize that even as they recognize the poverty that's in Africa, the poverty in African communities coincidentally. The poverty in these concentration camps, the so-called Indian reservations, the poverty in the barrios, the poverty of all the people in the world, there's an absolute refusal or inability to recognize the fundamental relationship here. That this poverty that is seen is a consequence of the wealth that we see with the colonizer. And in this relationship that we're talking about right now, all economic activity and production occurring in the world fundamentally occurs within this relationship. And there was a time when there was an understanding and movement where there was a trying to overturn this kind of social system. That's Mao versus the forces he was just referring to that are essentially economic activity occurring in the world fundamentally occurs within this relationship. That's China. But the chairman goes on. And there was a time when there was an understanding and movement where there was a trying to overturn this kind of social system, even as it was not clearly understood. And that's who Mao represents. That's Fidel, the Cubans, etc. Revolutionaries on the ground throughout the world that had theory and a vision of the type of society that would replace the old society, as opposed to what is going on in the part of the Chinese capitalist state, Indian capitalist state, that are not trying to build a new society, but rather trying to position themselves within, in a beneficial way, within a society or social system that forever will rest on the oppression of an exploitation of Africa. So today we see a concept, and that put all these forces, here you go, bro, and that put all these forces on a really progressive trajectory, because they were denying the validity of the social system, the capitalist system, the exploitation, etc., and recognizing, this is the chairman talking, and recognizing that the freedom of human beings can only come about as a consequence of overthrowing that. Today, we see a contest that's happening, but it's primarily a contest that is existing with different forces that are trying to take advantage over others, over the existing colonial mode of production. Not to overturn the colonial mode of production, or if it is to overturn the colonial mode of production, it is something that is gradual or incremental changes that might lead to some great leap at some later point. And that's real. And we're not just talking about Bernie Sanders and these other so-called democratic socialists whose theory is that if you just wage enough reform and struggles, then eventually there's going to be some magical moment where a socialist revolution occurs. But that line liquidates the necessity of the African proletariat building its own revolutionary state power with the conscious aim of overturning and destroying the colonial state. That's not an incidental thing. That's not something that we expect to happen through a process based on our theory. That's a reality that we construct. So, and it's a fundamental difference. And so, even forces like China, we're not talking about Bernie Sanders, just talking about Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Socialists and the white left within US borders or European borders, but we also talking about these forces that essentially have assumed the same line as the white left. And that's what we are looking at in the form of the Chinese Communist Party right now, where the so-called economic activity, or what they would refer to as revolution, has no, at least stated, aim of overturning the colonial mode of production, the colonial occupation of Africa by the UN, by the US, by the French. Where's China on the question of imperialists occupying Africa? China don't say, the Chinese so-called Communist Party doesn't say a damn thing about US colonial occupation of Africa. And in fact, they built the military base across the street from the US's largest military base in Djibouti to ensure that the US, the UN, and China got their back when it's time to ride on them pirates. That's what you're looking at. So we have to say these criticisms, but we're not criticizing the masses of China. We're criticizing the forces that are responsible for this arrangement right now. And the chairman says in the second paragraph, you know, there was a time when there was revolutionaries out here, like real, you know, it's sometimes we get into a point where we almost like mythology, like they like mythical creatures. Mao is like a fucking alien or something, you know what I mean? Like he's bigger than life, like he was a real human being. Che, Fidel, these were real people, like you and me, that had theory and that moved on that theory. So, and understood that the people are makers and shapers of history, you know? So it's a really powerful thing. And there was in the Black Panther Party, the Black Power Revolution of the 1960s, most importantly, in terms of revolutionary forces that was organizing in the nerve center the thing that makes it all possible, the colonial oppression of Africans within U.S. borders and on the continent and everywhere else. So anyway, we have to rebuild a revolutionary movement. You know what I'm saying? Not an alternative movement, not some shit that is rests on the pedestal. That's some shit that, you know, dismisses the colonial mode of production, but rather we're talking about the problems within its superstructure, right? We want to get to the core of the question. And somebody asked me, like, you know, where you stand on this transgender movement. And I said, yo, the transgender movement, just like any other social movement, has to unite under the leadership of the African Revolution, because you wouldn't even have a problem to talk about in terms of your inability to get a job, etc., or some type of oppressive treatment that you experience within U.S. society at the hands of the policymakers in the U.S. if it wasn't for the theft of the land of the indigenous people. So even if those so-called rights for equal treatment and, you know, an end to the oppression of this particular sector of the population, the white population, even if these shifts and these rights are acquired, just like we talked about the white woman was the potter. You know, white women got the right to become pigs, right? So we're not talking about, we're talking about if there's going to be rights for white women, transgender, or any other force within human society, and that includes Africans as well. The petty bourgeoisie that would try to solve its own problems in terms of its ability to integrate into the colonial system, colonial capitalist system. We say they all have to be subordinate to the demands of the African liberation movement. That's the critical question. Where do you stand on the bleeding of Africa and the socialist distribution of African wealth among African workers? Where do you stand on that shit? That's the real question. That's the real question. And that's what I'm always going to say. You know, it's not a subjective thing at all. It's mathematics, for real. All right, let's finish this up, man. Let's finish this up. Real talk. Real talk. All right. U.S. presence in Africa, part of 500-year-long occupation. And there was a time Mao sent guns to Africa. He put guns in the hands of African military forces with the express aim of fighting for national liberation. Mao did that. So where's, you know what I'm saying? That's the stance that all genuine communists must assume. U.S. military presence in Africa. So, like we said, U.S. has a long, 500-year-long occupation of Africa. U.S. military presence in Africa, Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Chad, Libya, Niger, whatever they call it. They probably mean nigger, right? Because we know all these names was given to us by the white man. But anyway, according to Gravitas, they try to make it sound fake, Niger. Whatever, man. So, quote, and there's other things, the U.S. embassy and consulates in South Africa, quotes to being said, I am proud that there are more than 600 American companies invested here, contributing, blah, blah, blah. So, of course, they always have the economic interest, but in terms of the military presence of U.S. imperialism, that is based in the need to have an armed and organization of violence to protect all this to protect this money that they taking out. You know what I mean? To guard the trains as they come out, basically. So, revolutionary struggle, and that's the basis of their concern about terrorism and Al-Shabaab over here, and Al-Qaeda might be here, ... This is about the U.S. maintaining a monopoly over violence and maintaining imperialist peace or stability. That's what it's about. Revolutionary struggle must be led by the proletariat. Not only does the Chinese capitalist state, for example, collaborate with neo-colonial governments in Africa, but the raw materials it extracts from Africa are transformed in China through the capitalist exploitation of Chinese workers. And it was stated in Statistica.com, quote, according to the latest data supplied by the World Bank, and they lay out some statistics. I don't want to read all of this, but the bottom line is that China at this point is characterized by imperialist economists that make up these systems of judging, the wealth of any given, or the size of an economy, a country's economy, they call China what they call a upper middle income poverty line, which is $5.50 a day. And almost a quarter of Chinese still living under that level in 2016. And somebody correctly in here actually raised, like, well, you know, the cost of living is a lot less in China. And that might be true. It probably is true. But the point is that poverty does exist in China. And although the legacy of colonialism, because China is building itself, recovering from centuries of European colonial domination by the British, the French, I believe at one point, you know, like had a stranglehold over China's economy and used the dynasties and whatnot as these neo-colonial forces to maintain that. So China, at the point of its revolution in 1939, was severely underdeveloped, you know? And Mao Zedong, who led the Chinese Revolution, not only had the task of winning state power for the workers, but also in resuscitating China's economy. This is before China started doing what it's doing in Africa. This is like when internally, you know what I'm saying? But the point is that if the poverty that exists in China today is not only or simply a consequence of exploitation of Chinese workers by the Chinese capitalist corporations and whatnot. It's not that. Because again, the only reason why poverty has been the starting point for this new period of Chinese development and growth is because they are recovering from at least 400 years of imperialist domination at the hands of Europe, right? So that's why there's poverty in China. However, what we have to analyze is how that poverty, what it is a product of in this particular moment in history and time, and how it can be overturned. Because again, if there is going to be salvation for the masses of Chinese in terms of economic development and whatnot, then a relationship trade-wise with Africa could help that, and probably would be almost absolutely necessary based on the amount and the types of resources that so-called advanced economy needs to sustain itself and further develop. Coltan, etc. You know, these are things that any so-called advanced society needs. So a relationship with Africa, it was probably would be in the interest of even a genuine socialist Chinese state and economy. But more than that, what we are saying is that the Chinese working class has to unite with the struggle for reparations to Africa. So, and there's a lot to be said in terms of Mao's approach to overturning the poverty and whatnot. And his, you know, that's what the Great Leap Forward was all about in terms of organizing a distribution of grains and other critical or essential resources that the population would need. And as a consequence, and there was a lot of problems with that in terms of the Great Leap Forward. It was an entire economic campaign that Mao launched to recover from the hundreds of years of imperialist domination. And it essentially centered around redistribution of agriculture and whatnot amongst the people. And the bottom line is that it resulted in millions of people dying and starving. And a lot of people blame that on Mao himself, but the reality is that there were forces on lower levels of the party that were giving incorrect reports on what was going on the ground in these various locations where the program was to be implemented. Why would Mao launch a program that he knew would fail and that would, you know, turn a blind? That has never been Mao's stance. It was a consequence of opportunism on lower levels of the Chinese Communist Party that allowed for the lack of resources and that were needed in the various places to be reported on and thus addressed and rectified in a timely fashion. And that's what resulted in the what some would characterize as the failure or the contradictions in the Great Leap Forward. That's important to say. But so I'm gonna continue reading. So applying the World Bank poverty in China is a direct result of the legacy of European and North American imperialist domination over China and all of Asia. It was only through the Chinese Revolution led by Mao Zedong that China achieved the ability to reduce its poverty rate. However, poverty in China still exists, as do wretched conditions designated for the nation's working poor, whose exploitation represents the underbelly of the state market capitalist economy the existing Chinese government administers over. The fact is that the Chinese Communist Party was hijacked by the petty bourgeoisie through and subsequent to the death of Chairman Mao Zedong. In the final analysis, the youth and the proletariat of the Chinese nation must answer Mao's call made at the onset of the Cultural Revolution and bombard the headquarters, take back control of the Chinese Communist Party, and as its first order of business, join the African-led Communist International that organizes the working class revolutionary parties of oppressed nations under one international Communist Party led by the African Socialist International, the advanced detachment of the African Revolution, the strategic point of the spear of the International Socialist Revolution. And we say why Africa must lead. As we have shown, there would be no capitalist exploitation of Chinese workers in China if it was not for the colonialist capitalist exploitation of the African working class itself. In fact, the basis of all economic development, socialist or capitalist, occurring within China and throughout the world is the colonialist capitalist expropriation of Africa's resources. Therefore, socialist struggle within the Chinese nation must be subordinate to the anti-colonial African revolution. And the same principle applies to all nations aspiring to ascend onto the pedestal of colonialist capitalism as equal and contending forces with US and European imperial white power. And we say concretely what it means. But what must be understood, and we're going to step off in just a second, y'all. But the real point is that the African revolution must be built in order for this relationship that we are calling for to occur between the Chinese proletariat and the African nation and the African working class. The African working class itself must build organization and impose these demands in terms of the type of relationship that we have with any other force. And sometimes the contradiction between such forces, such as the African working class and the Chinese working class, it's a non-antagonistic relationship. There's no it's not an antagonistic relationship. Both of these forces at this particular moment function under the domination of capitalists, right? And if given the opportunity or the ability, Chinese workers and and African workers would engage in an entirely different type of relationship, economically speaking. But and so the point is that part of what this movement that we are calling for to achieve genuine socialism in China must raise up demands that are central to the liberation of Africa. Reparations. China must pay reparations. Must engage in particular types of relationships with Africa and the African nations. So this is a relationship that must be determined or dictated by forces and higher levels of the organization than I am, but this is how we understand it from Black community control of the police. So concretely, this means A, uniting with the resistance of the African Revolution. This is what the Chinese proletariat and the Chinese Communist Party must do. This is what they must do. A, unite with the resistance of the African Revolution against US military occupation of Africa, whether direct or indirect. China must oppose US and European military occupation of Africa. B, mobilize the proletariat into African internationalist organization to overturn capitalist relations of production within China, India, etc., themselves and colonialist capitalist relations between the nations and Africa. Whether or not China, India, Russia, etc., or its proletariat unite with this call, the African working class must fulfill its historic mission to lead the successful struggle to overturn foreign occupation and colonialist and capitalist exploitation. The struggle for Black community control of the police within U.S. borders is essential to this task, as the domestic African colonies of Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, etc., constitute the headquarters of U.S. imperialist power worldwide. This has proven to be the case historically. In fact, in a December 26th presentation by the chairman, he notes that the vast majority of U.S. imperialist wars of aggression have been fought by African workers. This was certainly the case in Vietnam, and the French as well historically have used colonized workers to fight its imperialist wars. At the point that the African working class achieve revolutionary consciousness and use our guns against our colonial oppressors within U.S. borders instead of against other colonized peoples at the directive of imperialist ruling class, U.S. imperialism loses its capacity to impose its will on Africa and all of the oppressed nations. So, you know, that's what if there's a fist squeezed around Africa's neck, Cuba's neck, China's neck, Venezuela's neck, the brain that instructs that fist to squeeze is located right here inside U.S. borders, and its nerve centers, its entire system relies upon the exploitation and oppression of African workers right here, as well as the indigenous peoples as well. At the point that the African working class achieve revolutionary consciousness, and we said that this shift in strategic targets constitutes the basis for the Black community control the police struggle within U.S. borders. BCCP, the Black community control the police, understands that in a social system where the police function as a colonial, occupying military and oppressed and exploited Black communities, much as the Marines do in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Haiti, any shot fired by the colonized at the police is a righteous act of self-defense. Africans must join the organized Black community control the police struggle, the success of which will permanently end the terror we experience at the hands of occupying military forces trained to treat Africans like enemy combatants. We demand 1, the immediate withdrawal of the colonial police force from our oppressed and exploited communities and the right to mobilize for our own security. 2, the right to armed self-defense of the Black community. 3, we demand all rights consistent with being a free people, rights which include self-determination and self-government as the highest expression of genuine democracy. We demand independence in our lifetime. 4, we demand international democratic rights and self-determination for African people throughout the world. 5, we demand the establishment of a united, patriotic, and independent African government of workers and peasants aligned with the progressive and democratic forces of the African nation. And 6, we unite with building the African Socialist International as the revolutionary advanced detachment and general staff of the international African working class that is the essential requirement for the African working class working in its own selfish interest to lead the struggle for the liberation and unification of Africa and African people worldwide. All right, y'all. We'll be back next Thursday, all right? Yeah.